All right. Greetings from the dark continent, Conscious Caracal here. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Stream of Consciousness, where I'm talking to experts in their various fields about topics that I think my audience will find interesting, but also useful in their daily discussions with people or even debates if you are really into that. Going on Twitter, taking on some people in the battle of ideas. And I think this is what my show does. It gives you some weaponry that you can use in that battle. So tonight I'm talking to a recurrent guest. I'm going to ask him to tell us again who he is for people that are new to the show. But I think the majority of my audience already know him very well. Mr. Quentin Ferreira, very, very much welcome to my show. And maybe just for the, like I said, the people that don't know, just giving them a little bit of an elevator pitch about who you are.
Okay, thanks very much for having me again, Ernst. I'm Quentin Ferreira. I am a trained clinical psychologist. I grew up in Johannesburg, but I currently live in the Netherlands. I'm not practicing psychology officially now, but I still keep my mind working in a psychological manner, reading psychological theories, trying to understand and apply my psychological knowledge to basically understanding people, but also understanding the structures of society. And I like to weigh in every now and then on the politics and the socio-cultural milieu in South Africa.
No, right. I think that's a perfect, like I said, a perfect elevator pitch to get things going. So I already see people are in the chat already. Like I've told you in person, the live chat sometimes distracts me so much from the chat itself, because I think that's where some of the best gold is found, is there where the people are spontaneously getting their thoughts. But let's get through to the basics first. Let's lay the foundation first. You wrote an article, I think is it now 2 years ago, when you wrote,
it was a year ago last week.
Yeah. A year ago, all right. So you wrote this article, The Eternal Apartheid and the Power of Myth. And at the time, got a very good reaction from people. A lot of people, some people that I respect a lot within the South African intellectual and commentary sphere, gave it a lot of praise. So I think you can put that feather in your cap. But maybe just before we get into the article itself, what was the political environment at the time when you wrote this? What was going on around us, not even just around you, that kind of got you into this headspace where you had to put pen to paper?
The thing is, and now we're going to get into the subject pretty much immediately, this political space and this milieu has been happening for a very, very long time. And that's really part of the problem. And what I was really thinking about is like, why can't we see conversations moving past a certain point? I'm going to get to that a little bit more. And so I really started to pay a lot more attention to the way we were having political conversations about the problems and solutions to the problems in South Africa. And I noticed a few things. First of all, anytime we have to discuss anything, apartheid comes into the picture, right? So now I'm not advocating for an ahistorical view of the country, but it seems as if almost in any way to any topic, unrelated as it may be, apartheid has to come in. So why can't we move the conversation past that point? Another thing I was trying to figure out was, okay, well, when these conversations happen, why do they always proceed in such a stereotyped way? I mean, it's literally the most predictable thing. You know how a conversation is going to go before people even have it, as soon as they bring up apartheid into the mix. On the one hand, it will be about the unrepentant white privilege, and how the perpetually victimized African is always pushed by these historical forces and can't find their way to a more prosperous South Africa. I also was a bit perplexed about what I think is a strange phenomenon, which is, why are we looking at the present as if it was governed by the same forces that were governing the past? Because if we really are honest about it, I mean, the ANC has political power to the point of hegemony. They have set themselves up through their People's War as the sole authentic representation of black people in South Africa, obviously by eliminating all their political rivals. So I always wondered, like, people talk about contemporary South Africa as if the white people were still controlling things and still in the ascendancy, and that was very perplexing to me. And another thing that I was really trying to answer with this article was, why does the post-apartheid South Africa mirror so many features of apartheid South Africa in terms of its ideology. So that was my headspace, but I think that has been, ever since we got democracy in South Africa, this conversation has been proceeding in a certain way. And yeah, that's why I was trying to look at it.
So maybe let's break down the title itself, the Eternal Apartheid. Now, when you use that term, I've actually seen more people use that term on social media now. Actually, you've invented a new concept that has penetrated the discourse quite thoroughly. But what does it mean? To explain it to me like I'm five, in terms of if someone asks you, I've just saw someone use the term the Eternal Apartheid, and I don't know what they mean. What would you tell that person?
I would tell that person that I think the post-apartheid frame in which we discuss things about South Africa is corrupted to the point that we've almost lost a sense of history and a sense of identity. So that's why I called it the founding myth of post-apartheid South Africa. Like, nothing came before apartheid, and what has come after it has been a continuation in some way of the same psychological and ideological processes, just mirrored or inverted in subtle ways. And I think it's important to just first explain my conceptual form. So I've used a Jungian psychoanalytic approach to this problem, meaning that I'm looking at archetypes, and I'm looking at the interplay between order and chaos, and how entropy and order interact within a system. That's the man. I have exactly that same book with exactly that same cover. That's interesting. Yeah. And so in order to do this, we have to make a particular assumption, which is that every social structure starts in the mind. So what do I mean by that? I'm sure you know Andrew Breitbart always said that politics is downstream from culture, right?
I'll be able to draw a book from my bookcase for every person you bring up.
Cool. Okay, so my thinking is, okay, so if politics is downstream from culture, what is upstream from culture must be myth. And what is upstream from myth must be the mind. So how human societies have created myth in the past is that they've noticed what are called archetypes. So Carl Jung calls archetypes, basically, they're a symbolic representation of certain behaviors that seem to cluster around the theme. Okay, and we can get into that a little bit.
Like the Greek and Roman gods.
Exactly. So when you see a symbolic representation in a story, you know that it means something across cultures, right? Like the Roman gods or a hero does the same thing in every kind of story. And that's like almost the smallest unit of cultural transmission is a symbol, okay? And I like to say, I stole this idea from Daniel Dennett, the neuroscientist, which is that memes are the genes of cultural evolution. So certain ideas have been memed through repetitive usage, and because they serve a certain social function, and those memes have constellated around what I'm calling the Eternal Apartheid, this frame in which we now view the entire South African history, past, present, and even future. So that's not a 5-year-old explanation, I guess, but
it's a figure of speech. Well,
exactly.
Explain it to me like I'm 5 is a meme in itself. So
yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty much an internet slang of saying just put it to me simply. But yeah, no, it makes complete sense to me. And I think maybe before we continue, that whole idea of archetypes, what I meant there is a good example of it would be the Greek myths, where you have, for example, Roman and Greek myths. I don't remember there's a meme about it where they're like, the Greeks have all these mythical gods, and then the Romans just plagiarize all of them, giving them new names, like almost like a Chinese knockoff. But so you have a god that represents every facet of human life. You have the god of love, you have the god of war, you have the god of wrath, or whatever. And these are pretty much archetypes. And how I understand what you were saying here is that the Eternal Apartheid is not a single archetype, but rather a collection of them. And for example, one of the sub parts of it would be the unrepented white, this idea of only white people can be racist. You have all these white people are inherently racist, and they will always try to oppress whatever other groups they encounter, you have this archetype, and almost
Right.
the argument is made that all white people always move towards this stereotype, or they all have this tyrant inside of them, and then you have this the continually oppressed or marginalized group, or whatever, and it goes on.
Yeah, I call them the perpetually victimized African in the article.
Right. But now then the question arises from that. When was, and you use specifically the idea of myth, when was this myth forged, and who forged it?
Mm-hmm.
What are its origins?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic question. So I think this myth is actually forged in the struggle against apartheid. Because, as I said earlier, like memes spread through repetitive usage, and there's one of two ways in which they can spread. They can spread bottom up in the sense that an image or a form of symbol or a meme sort of emerges in society. And if that meme confers a survival advantage to members of a group, it spreads around, almost like a gene in evolutionary terms. That's why I say memes are the genes of cultural evolution. So that the struggle for apartheid was a struggle to break down a tyrannical order. Okay, a struggle against apartheid was a struggle to break down a tyrannical order, and in order to do that, you needed to have some kind of entropy, right? So, ideologically speaking and philosophically, some of the conceptualizations were of Black consciousness, for example. So Black consciousness was there to conscientize Black people to say, hey, you guys are individuals with value and worth, and you don't have to be in a subjugated position. Realize who you are and join together, and we can attack the oppression of apartheid. Another form of conceptualization was the Marxist conceptualization, which is deeply rooted in the ANC and the South African Communist Party, which are in the same WhatsApp group, as the kids say. So that sort of turns it into a struggle for the working class against the capitalist class, if you want to call it that. So that is where the myth sort of started. And at some point, I agree, it was necessary to bring some chaos into the order, because you have to fight against a tyrannical order. I mean, I would like to think I'm doing the same just by having this conversation, fighting against, an order that has become recalcitrant and doesn't allow for any other way of being and doing, right? So it has its genesis there. But unfortunately, what I saw was that what became a new order started to become, in a way, like the old order. So it also became resistant to challenge. It became recalcitrant. It became hungry for power and for a totalizing way of doing things and seeing things. And that's really, from the genesis of it to where it is now. It was first a way of finding entropy or introducing entropy into an order, but now it's become the new order itself.
And seeing as you you actually call it a myth, I've made the observation that there is a lot of mythical thinking when it comes to South African politics. For example, they seem to plagiarize a lot from the Old Testament when you look at the old myth about South Africa now that is now being repeated, where South Africa is pretty much the paradise on earth, the Garden of Eden. And then Jan van Riebeeck lands here, and as soon as his boot hits the white Western Cape sand, or the Cape sand, everything, the world falls, and the paradise is no more, and the world becomes a world of sin and struggle, and a world of pretty much just suffering. But before that, It was this perfect world, and I mean, we've heard this from South African politicians, where it was a world. South Africa was without crime, it was without murder or rape, and then the white man introduced all these vices and all these sins to the world. But then my question would be, seeing as this is a very typical structure of a myth, how does this origin myth of South Africa, does it in any way relate to this myth of apartheid, or this the Eternal Apartheid myth that you write about?
I think the archetypes are inherent in both of those sort of descriptions. So I think that's why it's important now to move to the conversation about the archetypes that I identify, because as you said, as soon as Jan arrived on the Dromedaris in 1652, which, by the way, was a long time after Bartholomew Diaz arrived in 1488. So just putting that out there. So from the moment they arrived, it was a battle between these unrepentant whites, and unrepentant connotes an original sin, right? So presuming a sin happened just by them landing there, that was the original sin. And the difference is that it's internal to the white person, okay? So they will never repent, they're unrepentant, they sinned de facto, and it is an internal deficit with them. And when they encountered the perpetually victimized African, they encountered people who, in the mythological terms, were just pushed along by the forces of fate. They didn't have their own history of their own. They weren't, also conquering neighboring tribes and going through what you would expect feudal societies
Almost like they
to do.
didn't have any type of human agency.
That's very important. Exactly. They victimized. They pushed along by forces of history. And it's in another sense, it's almost like if you describe someone like that, they need rescue, right? And that's why the ANC set themselves up as the liberation party. They had to rescue these perpetually victimized Africans. So that's I see words in there. Yeah, so those are the similarities, and those archetypes play out in almost any conversation you can expect to have about apartheid, or not even just about apartheid, about contemporary South Africa. It's always reduced to the unrepentant white, perpetually victimized African, and those two historical, the clash between African and Western civilization, has become this order of the eternal apartheid. And it's quite sad because, sorry, can you still see me? My screen just went off for a second.
Just a little bit of a freeze.
I see Nick talking about Joseph Campbell, mythological structure. And I actually read
so Nicholas says, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell is an excellent book that discusses the mythical structure and the role of the hero. So maybe just finish your thought there and then we can get to that comment.
Yeah. Well, sure. I wanted to say that what is supposed to happen when two cultures collide is a process this anthropologist Gregory Bateson calls schismogenesis, which means that cultures come together and around the edges, through the iterated interactions between the groups, new norms and values emerge, right? So if we weren't, if the cultures were allowed to develop without this top-down imposition of these archetypes, without the constantly being told, yeah, but you're the unrepentant white and you're the victim, we might have actually developed a beautiful synthesis of Western culture and African culture and Indian culture and colored culture and, I mean, even Malay culture that would have formed the melting pot of South Africa. But I think this process has become arrested. And I believe that we as contemporary South Africans need to introduce some entropy and to get this process of cultural renaissance happening again.
But no, a bit more of a controversial question, seeing as, if I understand you correctly, the entire discourse is pretty much not just in South Africa, but throughout human history, our discourse is just saturated with this mythical structure of storytelling and framing everything as mythical. But almost, I've also made this point on previous shows where I said, it's almost as if we've eaten too much of a steady diet of fiction, where we start viewing the world as fictional and operating as the fiction that we consumed when we were little. There has to be a villain, there has to be a hero, whatever. But then my controversial question would be, how do you fight against this type of malicious myth-making that is used against you? Do you fight it with just rational arguments and reasoning against it, or do you fight it with your myths of your own, almost like a mythical culture war, if you will?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. Let me think about that for a second. So, okay, I think that there is a lot to be said for a cultural war, because essentially what a myth is a collection of symbols and a collection of memes, right, that tell a story, okay? And as Nick mentioned, the hero. So in the hero story, what always happens is the hero starts off a bit like not sure of himself, a bit weak, and he goes through some kind of difficult trial and tribulation, learns some ancient wisdom.
Usually fails at first.
Yeah, exactly. Fails at first, is confronted with a lot of obstacles, but through that is able to attain some ancient wisdom from the past, reconnecting him with his ancient roots and his power, and then he's able to overcome the challenge or evil. And this goes back to what I said about what one of the big problems with the Eternal Apartheid is that it's robbed people of their roots and their history. And we've been taught to believe that ever since South Africa, ever since 1652, it was this case of black and white interests being diametrically opposed. And that's the big lie at the core of the Eternal Apartheid. So I think to overcome this myth, we need to tell stories and have new metaphors where we can see that actually black and white interests are the same. We can cooperate. We can form a synthesis of culture. We just need to realize what's standing in our way from a mythological point of view. And it's this frame that we are programmed almost or conscientized to thinking in, which is the frame of the Eternal Apartheid. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I think that answers it sufficiently. But then at the same time, this is, if you're talking about this very phenomenon that is still pretty evident in the discourse today. Now that you're looking at let's go a bit more modern in terms of where we are specifically now in the present, in the lockdown, and with the ANC pretty much having a full reign over, even more control over South Africa than ever before. Does this myth manifest in any unique way during this crisis now that it did not before, from what you've seen or observed in the past, I don't know, like 2 months?
I don't think it's a unique way. I think it's a totally predictable way. And again, it's about the unrepentant white and the perpetually victimized African. So if we look at how the discourse is being framed, like if we look at the Western Cape, for instance, now the Western Cape is probably the skunk of the country because they're doing more coronavirus testing and have more cases. But there is an undercurrent there, which is that, the Western Cape is the white place, the DA province. And they don't care about black lives because they're going around jogging and trying to walk their dogs, and they are unrepentant. And they are the ones who want people to go back to work and lose their lives. And the perpetually victimized Africans, again, will be the victim of this because they have no agency themselves. We can't expect them to practice social distancing. We can't expect or physical distancing. We can't expect them to actually take control of their lives. And we're now at the mercy again of these unrepentant whites. And I think he's a total moron, but I saw a tweet from Mbuyiseni Ndlozi saying something like, the lockdown will have to punish the white monopoly capital. And that's really it. It's the same theme all the time. And
because
the
victim, unrepentant, and
exactly
unrepentant needs to be punished.
Right. We must get into the rituals of ideological inquisition and stuff like that a bit later. Just remind me. But exactly. So that has played out in the same way. I don't know. That's my opinion. I don't know if you've seen something new or a new discourse, but to me, it really seems to fit those two archetypes.
Right. Just making a note here. Right. So, no, definitely. I saw something where I think is the best example of actually two cases. First case was Mr. Gareth Cliff's debate that I think everyone that is listening to the show has seen in partial, or has heard, or what happened, or what transpired there. I think that was one of the clear examples of this myth manifesting and bleeding into reality.
Right.
The type of treatment that Mr. Cliff was subjected to in that interview, I think, was actually the perfect example of where this type of mythical thinking or the eternal apartheid comes to the fore. But then another, and we can get into that now, but then just another example, I think, that's pretty much also demonstrated perfectly is what happened to Mr. Steenhuisen when he was on that interview, and John Steenhuisen, the head of the DA, when he was asked, what was the exact word? Who do you speak for? Or who is we?
Who is the list of people or whatever,
And he said, we want to open the economy. And they asked, who are we? And I think that's pretty much as blatant as it gets. So what are your thoughts on those two examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Gareth Cliff did what everyone needs to do, which is he broke through the frame. He broke through the Eternal Apartheid. He refused to take the role that was being pushed onto him, the unrepentant whites, and he called what was going on at the process level. So in psychology and psychotherapy, there's always two levels to a conversation. There's multiple, actually, but the main ones are the content, which is what is being said, and the process underneath that, which is what is happening because of what is being said. So Gareth Cliff immediately recognized that this argument was being framed in a particular way. And why else would you invite someone doing a PhD in critical theory, critical racial theory, to a discussion about
ever heard of?
Exactly, to discuss a lockdown, a letter about the lockdown, if you weren't trying to frame the conversation in a particular way. And Gareth saw that immediately. He cut right through it, and he blew it out the water. And that was, for me, a great thing to see. John Steenhuisen.
Just before you go into John Steenhuisen, something I also noticed, the top comment when I watched that interview with Gareth, the top comment was under that. I don't think it is the top comment anymore, but the first comment that I read was that the person said, when the host or the host of this debate started off the debate with the joke, why are you writing letters to the president, Mr. Cliff? That set the tone for the entire debate. Or then the debate's fate was sealed.
Right. And this goes back to, why do these conversations always proceed in such a stereotyped way? Nothing was solved at the end of it all, but we got dragged into the eternal apartheid, and all of a sudden we were living in the end of the 1980s, you know? So
right, that's just what I wanted to add on there, but you were starting to analyze the John Steenhuisen occurrence.
Yeah, I think, John, I haven't made up my mind about him. I am a fan of the philosopher queen Gwen Ngwenya, and I think she should lead the DA. But I haven't really made my mind up about John, but I think he missed an opportunity to talk about the frame of the conversation, because he didn't go and say, okay, I see you're asking me for a list of people. Are you trying to say that because I'm a white person, I can only speak for white people? And is that your assumption deep down? Because then you're going to drag me into the eternal apartheid, and we're never going to get anywhere with this conversation. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about solutions. So immediately he's reframed the whole thing, and he's called the game for what it is. And that's an essential part of psychoanalysis, if you will, is to make that unconscious process conscious. And once you do that, it doesn't have the power to guide your behavior anymore. So John missed that opportunity, and if he wants some lessons in strategy, he should just DM me.
All right, but before we continue, maybe you should give a quick lesson in strategy right now. I'm going to give you I'm going to roll out the red carpet so you can do it right now. Just a quick lesson in terms of when you are confronted, or you get a little bit of a sniff of you are in the territory of people trying to pull you into this eternal apartheid type of dialogue or rhetoric. What is the go-to method of how to deal with it? What should your approach to that be?
Yeah, so you should make the conversation about the way you're having the conversation. So don't respond to the content of what they're saying. So if they ask you for a list of people, you have to say, well, I assume because you're asking me for a list of people, you're apportioning, you're making me the representation of all whites. And I'm not that. I'm an individual, and I have nothing to apologize for because I didn't oppress anyone myself. So I won't engage in that type of conversation. I'm here to talk about X, Y, and Z. And so if we can't have a conversation that moves past this towards a solution, then there's no point in having that kind of conversation. So it's really it's about making that the frame more clear and calling the frame out for what it is, and then breaking the cycle of the eternal apartheid.
So what you're saying is when you start getting the very telltale hints that your opponents are not debating you in good faith, they are trying to drag you into pretty much a racialized debate about they want to get you to the point where they're only going to be happy if you admit that you are an evil piece of shit because you're white, and if you don't do that, then they're not going to be happy. As soon as you start getting that idea, you realize that these folks are not coming in good faith. Then you have to realize, but I'm not going to then go on the defensive and play their game. You need to call them out on the spot for what they are trying to do. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And what you really need to keep in mind, and this is at the core of everything, is whose interests are served by the way we frame these debates. And those are the custodians of the eternal apartheid. Because while I really have a lot of faith in the people of South Africa to join forces and to find solutions, if we keep trapped in the cycle, all that's going to happen is the ANC is just going to keep their political hegemony, and we're never going to be able to move past these, this arrested development, this arrested cultural development, if you will. And that's very important. Remember whose interests are served. And, a funny thing is, on one hand, we can call it the founding myth, but if you want to bring a Marxist conceptualization into it, I'm not a Marxist, but I learned a lot from Slavoj Žižek in this regard. So Marx saw ideology as the superstructure of society, which means that it colors the way you see everything else. It's almost as if you put on the lenses of, when you put on sunglasses, it changes the way the world looks to you. That's what it's like. Exactly. That's what it's like if you're operating on an ideological level. You're not seeing reality for what it really is. You are using these cognitive schemas to interpret reality, and then that always serves the interests of the ruling class, rather. So understanding that, hey, now they're trying to get you to see the world in a particular way, and there's no way you can win by playing the game on those terms. You have to play the game on your own terms and on different terms, and that's the only way out.
And talking about the role that ideology plays psychologically, we had an entire different discussion on this call, the Possessed by Ideology with Quentin Ferreira. You can go watch it on my channel. It will be very easy to find, or you can just search in the search bar on YouTube, Quentin Ferreira, Possessed by Ideology, or Possessed by Ideology, Conscious Character, and you'll find it. We had a very detailed discussion about this, but maybe to condense that discussion just in a small bite-sized chunk. What you're talking about here, you're talking about putting on a lens, and that's how the world makes sense to you and makes you see the world differently. And I've made this point to a lot of people where, for example, when Germ says he thinks a lot of the outrage online that when he draws a cartoon and people are outraged about it and they start literally foaming at the mouth about it. He thinks a lot of these oaks are putting on a scene. They're putting on an acting outrage rather than actually being. And I have to say I disagree with him. I see it a different way. I see it as people that are genuinely outraged. What you need to understand, and I've told him this, you need to understand that these people don't see the world the same way you do. You might look at a painting and you might think it is the ugliest, meaningless, vapid piece of garbage you've ever seen. And these people will look at that exact same painting and say, this is the most powerful painting I've ever seen. It tells this amazing story of fighting oppression or whatever pretentious garbage they want to attach to it, but they genuinely believe it. It's not like they are putting on an act. I don't think the majority of people have the mental energy or the psychic energy to put up an act as convincing as that for years or decades. You have to genuinely believe that the ideological garbage that they are possessed with to have that reaction. Do you agree, disagree? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely agree with you 100%. Actually, on the subject, I wrote another article earlier this year called Germ, Helen Ziller, and the Grand Ideological Inquisition. So, which describes this topic from a bit of a different perspective, still a sort of psychoanalytic / Marxist perspective, which is that the dominant ideology serves the ruling elite. If you look at Germ's art, you can interpret it in a racist way, or you can interpret it in an attack on the dominant ideology. And I think the cartoon in particular that caused the last outrage was the one about Malema, where he was like, you should be in jail for the land you stole.
And then Malema, the white person tells him, you need to be in jail because you raped my wife, or something like that.
Exactly. So, and the last frame is Malema going, I didn't do that, and the white dude says, exactly. So two people look at that cartoon. I see it as something else, and someone sees it as, this is playing on a trope of black men and being rapists and whatever, which is what Jonathan Janssen said in a post, and I described that in the article. But this is actually a very interesting point, because I feel like people who probably don't want to serve the interests of the eternal apartheid end up doing so unwittingly, by acting as ideological inquisitors. And this is also driven by the possession by these archetypes. So this is a bit of a complex idea for me to explain. But in psychoanalytic terms, when we talk about like an unconscious conflict, what you need to realize is your external behavior serves as a compensatory mechanism for your unconscious conflict. The most simple way to explain this is to use the example of narcissism. So everyone knows what narcissistic personality disorder is, or what a narcissist is, or how they behave. It's someone
I would even go as far as to say a lot of the people watching this stream know of the myth of Narcissus and where the term of narcissism comes from.
Right, exactly. The man who fell in love with his own reflection, right? And yeah. And so a narcissist is someone who has a very grandiose sense of self. He expects special, or he or she expects special treatment, but without having any commiserate achievements for that. And deep down, that is a compensation for a very insecure sense of self and a very, very low sense of self-worth. So the internal struggle is compensated for in an external way. So when I look at ideological inquisition and how the archetype of the unrepentant white and perpetually victimized African play into this. So Helen Ziller, let's say, for instance, German Helen Ziller, right? That cartoon came out. People called Helen Ziller racist for tweeting the cartoon. Now, some people genuinely don't like racism. I'm one of those, right? But some people think that by being the savior to the to the perpetually victimized African, they are fighting against racism. But sometimes the racism isn't there. So what you're doing is you're becoming an ideological inquisitor. So you are using the ANC's ideology to see the world, and you're saying, but that's racist, and we should expunge you from our society. But you're not really engaging with the substance
maybe
of the matter.
Just before you continue, for my Afrikaans audience, could you maybe explain what an inquisitor is?
Okay, actually, I need to explain where I stole this idea from. So last year I read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and it's one of the most amazing, beautiful works of literature. Anyway, the story it's a story of three brothers. The one brother is Alyosha, is a monk, and then the other brother Ivan, he represents an intellectual, sort of atheistic, up and coming Russian elite, right? And so in order to provoke his brother, he tells him the story of the Grand Inquisitor. So in the story of the Grand Inquisitor, and you guys should look this up, it's a beautiful allegory. What happens is, in the height of the Spanish Inquisition, where the Catholic Church was trying to purge all the heresy from the doctrine, Jesus appears in Sevilla, and the Grand Inquisitor imprisons Jesus because Jesus poses a threat to the established order of the church in a way. So he's like, listen, I know people aren't ready for you, Jesus. You have to go in jail. And the Inquisitor ends up, having a very interesting conversation with Jesus. But the Inquisitor, what he does is he kind of prevents the second coming in a way. And that's the whole idea of the church, is to be the custodians of the second coming. So similarly, when you act as an ideological inquisitor, you're actually preventing non-racialism from happening by racializing something. And you are playing into the ANC's ideology. You are playing into the Eternal Apartheid. And that's a very, very difficult thing to realize, because I don't like racism. And I think we should call it when we see it. But if we call it when it's not there, that's a whole other thing. And we need to be quite aware. Are we being possessed by an archetype? And if we're being possessed by the archetype of the unrepentant white, how do we compensate for that? Through white guilt, through trying to remedy some sin that we never really committed. And if we project onto a black person the perpetually victimized African and assume they have no agency, it's almost like a soft bigotry of low expectations. Like, you have to save the poor black guy because he is just a victim of historical forces.
Well, we see it with Ramaphoria doing a pretty damn average speech, and then all these liberal white women on Twitter just say, this was his JFK moment. I've never been moved by a speech like this. This needs to be immortalized in the archives of humanity as one of the most best articulated speeches ever made by a mortal man. And then you realize they're talking about Cyril Ramaphosa like they're talking to a grade 1 learner that just did his oral presentation. And they're like, yo, Yanni, you just did the best oral presentation I've ever seen. Well done. You're going to become president one day. So it's exactly the same mentality as I see it.
Right. And I mean, for me, that's extremely dehumanizing to a person, like that having that level of low expectation. But I think it's because people are trying to avoid being seen as that type of white savior, or like that, a white man criticized the presidents of South Africa. He's definitely an unrepentant white. We don't want to be that, so we compensate for it by going, oh, Cyrophilia Ramaphoria from Cape Town to Pretoria.
Well, if you guys didn't catch the reference there, Mr. Quentin was referencing an excellent song by Chris Chameleon. Go check it out. I used it as my outro song on one of my previous videos. And here, Mr. Odin Moja, a loyal friend of the show, says, actually, I'm fine. I need no saving.
Well, you're going to save a lot of people, my friend.
Right, and I said, I'm just going to check, give the chat some love before we... Well, man, I usually stop the conversation halfway just to tell everyone thanks for tuning in and just taking like a little breather break. But man, it's been so interesting. I missed it completely with 10 minutes overdue. But yeah, thank you everyone that's listening tonight. We have a very nice audience amassed here, and as always, the chat is 100% on fire. And if one of your comments catches my eye, I will definitely put it on screen so you can be part of the conversation. If you have any questions for Mr. Ferreira as well, please don't be shy to ask. I will definitely relay them to him. And then
I saw one question about the bookcase, and I don't organize it by colors. It's my wife who does that. My wife is in charge of aesthetics.
At least you're not like those postmodernists that turn the books on the what's the word? They turn them around so that they match the wood color of the bookcase. Like the paper color matches it, so it's more equal. But it's the most impractical thing ever. But it just shows that, like, those people that keep books in their house that they've never read. Even though I'm going to be a hypocrite if I said I've read all these books, I haven't
read all of these either.
But yeah.
Before we segue out of this ritualistic aspect, I think the thing about a ritual that you must understand is a ritual is a way of performing an action that links back to myth or ideology, right? So the simplest way for me to explain it is like I was raised Catholic. So when I take communion, I'm not just eating a wafer. I'm linking back to the Last Supper and the memory of Jesus, who said, eat my body, drink my blood, and do this to remember me, right? Mm-hmm. So by eating that wafer, I am showing that I buy into that belief system. And so by being part of the ideological inquisition, you are showing you buy into the Eternal Apartheid. So I covered the unrepentant white, but I just want to talk about the archetypal compensations of the perpetually victimized African.
Yeah, go ahead. You've got the floor.
And I think this... we see this playing out a lot. So what I learned when I was working in a children's hospital, Rahima Musa, in Johannesburg, what I found was a lot of children who were victimized and bullied, in order to really attain some sense of agency and self-worth, they identified with the bullier and became bullies themselves. And I see this also happening, like the example of that young girl who made some tweets and now can't be Miss South Africa, some nonsense like that.
Yeah. Like it had South African social media ablaze this week.
Right. So that's an example of the perpetually victimized African. The possession by that archetype allows you to use your victimhood to victimize others. So she said the N-word in a few tweets. And look, I listen to rap music. I know that word means different things depending on who says it to whom and the context that it's used. So if it's just used, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's used to oppress or victimize someone. But you see people feigning outrage. I don't think a lot of them are really offended by it. But they're saying, well, you can't use that word. That's our word. And because you used that word, we now have license to punish you. And I think a lot of the policies that we're seeing from the ANC since the end of apartheid come from this: we were bullied, so now we must bully. We are the perpetually victimized ones. Our victimhood allows us to justify now becoming the bully and the oppressor. And yeah, words and I'd still smash though. Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that, but because my wife is sitting right here. But yeah, that is the compensation for that archetype at a psychological level.
But then, if you look at that logic, that idea of we were bullied back in the day, therefore we have free license to bully today and have our full. When will they have their full? I mean, we can only speculate. I mean, these are all individuals talking about this. They don't all agree in terms of the timeline. But if you had to speculate, what are they implying? Do they just have free license to oppress until, if I can take some words from Mr. Jacob Zuma, until Jesus comes back? Or is there some type of end where they say, okay, but by this year we will have had our full. As soon as our reign has lasted as long as apartheid, then things will be equal. So basically my question is, let's for the sake of argument say that there was something lost in the past, and to regain it, some type of cost or sacrifice needs to be made in the present.
Mm-hmm.
When will that actually, within the, let's call it the ANC canon, when will that be reached? When will we reach that equilibrium where now we are equal and now we can move forward without all of the revenge?
Well, yeah, that's why I call it the eternal apartheid, because there is no end to it. As long as that frame continues to operate, as long as those two archetypes and people are possessed by those archetypes, there is no way of ending it, because it's an unconscious thing. So we're expecting that, yeah, okay, at some degree of, let's say, social equality or whatever, we can stop doing that. But it won't happen, because these processes are playing out unconsciously all the time. And unless we can make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to have power over us, because many people don't really realize that they're letting their ideology do the thinking for them, or they've been sort of sold this myth and they believe this is the true reality.
I see a Sideline Opinions put a quote from a very dubious source in the chat. He says, history does nothing. It does not possess great riches. It does not fight battles. It is rather humans, the real living people, that do possess and fight everything. Karl Marx. Your thoughts on that quote, or the sentiments of that quote, Mr. Ferreira?
Well, you know what? Like, I'm not going to lie. I actually think Marx was very good in the way he critiqued ideology. I haven't read like all of his stuff, but from what I've read, like in Zizek, who uses Marx to critique ideology, I think there is something to that. But where I think Karl Marx goes wrong is that, economically, obviously, but human beings really do need a sense of continuity between the past, the present, and the future. And if we think we can just sort of make it up, if like he sort of sees history as teleological, we're going to go from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, and that's the end of history. I don't believe that. I believe more in what Hegel would say, which is that human beings will swing like a pendulum from one state to another. So we'll go too far this way, and then we'll go, oh shit, we went too far. Then we'll overcompensate and go too far that way. And I don't think we can look at history to see like a predetermined and predestined thing. I think we can only really understand it when it's happened already, So
you're saying the pendulum never comes to a rest.
Exactly. And we kind of always playing catch up. And that's where that very cool quote, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk, comes from. So wisdom and philosophy and knowledge can really only happen. We can really only understand things at the dusk, when the day is done. And the owl of Minerva, and Minerva was the Greek or Roman goddess of wisdom. And her owl would only fly at the end of the day.
I see here's a question for you, Quentin, from Bernard T. Brits. He asks, Quentin, seeing that African, Western, Eastern rituals differ vastly, how do we square different rituals if no stories are shared between these cultures? Firstly, very good question, Bernard.
Yeah, it is. It is a very good question. You can see that he's a smart guy. But I will have to.
He's definitely not a Bernard. He's a Bernard.
He's Bernard. Yeah, he's definitely Bernard. I actually must disagree that although they don't share the same stories. They share the same archetypes, and that was the genius of Carl Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious, which is that yes, you have your individual unconscious, which is made up of all your own internal struggles, but the culture at large has its own, and the world at large has another level of unconscious, which is the repertoire, or not the repertoire, the repository rather, of all of the archetypes and the templates for myth and culture. So the hero story exists in the West, in the East, in African culture. The meaning of a serpent in African culture is similar to Western culture. The Asian culture has it a little bit different. The dragon is actually a good thing in their mythology. But the hero story,
religion, the serpent is also negative.
Yeah, exactly. And that's more like a sort of Judeo-Christian Western type of philosophy. So while we don't have the same stories, we have the same archetypes. And that's why I don't think that we can't reconcile certain cultural norms. And that's why I say we need to return to a stage of schismogenesis, where we actually, through our interactions, we come to find new ways of doing things, new norms, new ways of being. But we're stuck in the eternal apartheid. So until we can overcome that, we can't really progress past that. And I really actually think that we have to return in some way to telling new stories of cooperation between the different races, the different tribes. And if we can work together and work towards something from a point of view that our interests are not diametrically opposed, they are the same. Because that's the big lie at the core of the eternal apartheid, that the interests of blacks and whites are diametrically opposed. If we can move to telling new stories, if we can conceptualize of those kind of things, I think we can form a new cultural understanding from there forward. It's difficult to do in practice, but we are on the way to do that.
Well, I hope that answers your question, Bernard. And then I see here we've been graced with a Wotanism. So Mr. Odin Moja says, how the fuck are you going to take any advice from a dude that looks like homeless disco Santa Claus? No, very well put, my man. And then let's see here. We seem to have a Carl Jung fan in the chat right now. Red Sky says, love Carl Jung. Me too.
Me too.
And let's just see here. And here's another quote from Hegel. You just mentioned him earlier. Experience and history teaches us that nations and governments learn nothing from history.
Yeah.
Well, okay. And now that I've given the chat some love, I want to get back, because I've actually got more questions about this theory of yours. So, I mean, now we've touched on what is the eternal apartheid. We've talked about its mechanisms. We've talked about the ideological inquisition that goes on under this myth, and we've also seen we've discussed the manifestations of it in different dimensions of society. But then something that might be the pharmacon of this theory, where, and if you're not familiar, the pharmacon is Plato's conception of a poison or a cure. So it's something that you drink that can either kill you or it will cure you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the pharmacon in this entire thing will definitely be the alternative media, or the rise of alternative media that we've seen in the past. I wouldn't even say 10 years. I would say as little as 5 years. Maybe 6 years. Now, my question to you then is, what is the role of the alternative media in combating this malicious myth? Do you think it is a new step towards winning the battle, or do you think it's only a small blip on the radar?
No, absolutely. I think it is a revolutionary step to winning the battle. So I'm actually very critical of mainstream media, not because I'm like a total conspiracy theorist, but because I understand, and we can see it, And the big culprits, we all know who they are. Adrian Basson, Ferriel, what's that guy? Max Dupree, Nicholas Bauer. Yeah. They derive their power from ideological proximity to the state, right? So in a sense, they are part of the ruling elite. And that's why they're always acting like ideological inquisitors. Whether they mean to or not, they are custodians of the eternal apartheid, because the ideological proximity of the media to the state is how they are the mainstream media. And we know that, for instance, a lot of the media houses are owned by people with political connections and so on and so forth. So this is why I think alternative media is so important, because we can have the conversations in the alternative media space that are outside of the frame of the eternal apartheid. So we can almost act like the agents of entropy that can break some pieces off this stultifying and crystallizing and dysfunctional culture, because it has tended towards totalitarianism. And the alternative media are not beholden to anyone. They don't derive any power from proximity to the organs of the state or to the ruling elite. They derive their power because from a bottom-up level, their message resonates. And so this goes back to like what I said earlier about how memes spread. So in my article, I touched on like the Council of Nicaea, which was I think it was Constantine, a Roman emperor. So he kind of met with some people and they decided upon an officially codified doctrine of Christianity, okay? And that was to become the Catholic Church later on. And the Catholic Church had the monopoly on truth. And what happened, which I think is really cool, it was the Reformation. And a lot of your ancestors came and said, hang on, you Southern Europeans, I'm not going to listen to you and have you interpreting God's will for me. I actually think I can read the Bible and I can directly commune with God. And I love this. In Utrecht, there is a church that is formerly a Catholic church. And so it has all the icons that are on the wall. But in Protestantism, you can't have icons. So they've smashed the faces off the icons because that church was reformed. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for what's going on here. So they have the officially codified doctrine. They have the ideology. They have the eternal apartheid, the story that we have to tell and we have to pray at this altar. And the alternative media can go, hang on, I won't pray on that altar. I will tell the story from where I see it. And it will resonate with people as it clearly has been doing. Yeah. And that is one way to break the shackles of the eternal apartheid, those mind-forged manacles.
I love that metaphor of the alternative media refusing to bow in front of the golden calf. And just a perfect segue from that, the Dodgy Idealist says, Quentin is starting to ignite my interest in symbolism.
It's everything.
Yeah,
everything is symbolic. And that's how we think. I mean, language is all symbolism, and language is almost like a computer program that helps us run our algorithms about the world. So if we really look at it that way, language is the most powerful symbol that we have. And that's why I will not speak in the language of the eternal apartheid.
And I see just when you mentioned the mainstream media and now the alternative media and the contrast between the two, I think about this headline a lot, man. I really do. Editorial, Ramaphosa was majestic. Now the rest of us must follow. And this is written by the editor of News 24.
Is that Basson?
Himself.
Of course. Yeah.
Now, isn't this the perfect example of exactly your entire theory condensed into one screenshot?
Yeah, absolutely. And like the Grand Inquisitor in the story of the Grand Inquisition. So he's preventing non-racialism from taking place by bowing at the altar of the eternal apartheid, by continuing to propagate the lie that black and white interests are diametrically opposed. And yeah, it's like, that's what I said before. These conversations are so stereotyped. It's so predictable. We know what Adrian Basson is going to do. And I found him out about his NW Nazi shit. And actually, I think he even tweeted the word unrepentant. I could be wrong, but I think he said something about kantspatters. And and I was like, that was actually what told me some bullshit was afoot. I was like, aha, here's the unrepentant whites again. Why now? And then I went and looked deeper, and I found out that, that story was a lot of bullshit.
Mm. No, and I think you made an excellent thread on exposing that story. But I think it's exactly the type of thing that you see would manifest in a society that has been completely just indulged, that is just completely indulged in this myth. And I'm seeing here, Quentin, you're getting a lot of love from the chat tonight. William,
I return the love.
says, very interesting, Quentin.
Thank you, William.
And but also thank you again for everyone that's taking part in the chat. I always try to encourage as many people as possible to be part of the conversation. That's what sets us apart from the mainstream media, is that we actually have a relationship with our listeners, and we can talk about things together and figure out what's going on. All these mainstream sites either censor their comment sections or they just turn them off completely. So
may I be so presumptuous as to draw your attention to another comment by Bruce Thackwell, which says Quentin throws the light. I want to use that opportunity to talk about.
Quentin throws the light.
Hey, Bruce. So I want you guys to look at the archetype of the trickster. Go and research that. So in some mythologies, the trickster is the one who brings light, who through his way of telling, like a court jester, right? A court jester can tell the truth in this particular way that only he can tell.
Yeah, right? He's the only person in the king's court that's allowed to insult the king.
Right, exactly. So they bring the light of consciousness into the darkness of unconsciousness. And there's a brilliant psychoanalytic article which is called The Coyote Barks at Prometheus, written by a South African Jungian analyst who's gone over to the States. What's his name? I think it's Roger Brooke. Fantastic. And I think you can find the article, The Coyote Barks at Prometheus. And in the myth, the Native American myth of Coyote steals fire. Just like Prometheus stole the fire of the gods and brought it back to human beings. And that's like an archetype for the psychotherapist stance. Through tricks and through using language, we try to bring light into the darkness. So I'm glad you picked up on that there. And sorry to disrupt your comment, the earlier one from Sideliner, but I just wanted to put that out there.
I'm just going to put a link in the chat to that article. You can find it on ResearchGate, and I'm pretty sure you can get that. ResearchGate will give you free access to that article. I'm 90% sure.
Fantastic article.
Yeah, I just saw. Oh, here it is. I told you, dude, I was making a joke, but it seems that I'm completely true. I'm just going to be able to pull a book from my bookshelf for every comment or person that is named in this conversation or in the chat. Because here, Mr. Huxley, facts do not stop to exist because they are ignored. Well, Sideliner, thank you very much for dropping all these quotes in the chat. Very, very,
absolutely,
very relevant. And something else caught my eye now. I'm just going to check here. Right, here's the thing. So Moderate says, indoctrination takes time and patience, just like eroding one's freedoms. And this is something I've touched on in many of my opinion pieces, and even one of my quotes. The funniest thing was seeing someone on Twitter actually post a quote in quotation marks and then attributing it to Adams Van Zyl. And it was a quote of mine where I said, tyranny marches one concealed step at a time. And this is exactly what Moderate is saying here as well, is that tyranny and indoctrination is not something that happens overnight. The Marxists taking over academia and the music industry and the film industry didn't just happen overnight. It's something that slowly happens, and it only gets to its nexus, or it only reaches its peak because you allowed it to happen, or because you were just too fast asleep.
Yeah, exactly the same way that the Eternal Apartheid took over. It was, first, it served a function that I think was good. It was a challenge to a tyrannical order. But through repeated recourse to that, people kept praying at the altar of the Eternal Apartheid. It became itself the new order. So it was chaos, but now it's order through repetitive use. And that's now why we have to be agents of, a little bit of disorder, agents of chaos, agents of entropy to break it down at its foundations.
No, exactly. And I think that actually touches on something when I asked you earlier, how do we fight back against this? I think, and I think I can sum up your answer. you fight back against this by pointing out that the emperor wears no clothes. I think that's exactly what you said in regards to, well, I'm summing it up now with a metaphor, but that's, I think, the gist of your advice in terms of when you are confronted with this myth of the eternal apartheid, or its underlying themes of the unrepentant white, or the constantly victimized minority, or, well, in an American context, the minority, in the South African context, just a black South African. The only way, or the most effective way to deal with it, is to point out and say the emperor is wearing no clothes. And I think that's something that people can take away from this, because I know a lot of people have been struggling with trying to rationalize in regards to how to deal with this type of rhetoric, because it's malicious. It's not just a myth that is out there to make sense of the world. It's a myth that tries to make sense of the world by malicious means. It tries to frame the world in terms of there are angels and demons, and the demons are not just mythical creatures; they are real people with a pale complexion. And I think that's really the insidious part of it. That's what really gets to me in regards to the malicious nature of it. It's not just an innocent little story that people tell each other to try and make sense of the world. Like, for example, when you tell a child that the tooth mouse is going to come get his tooth if he leaves it in a shoe under his bed, that's an innocent story. But this one is a lot more insidious and a lot more hateful, if you really can say that. And the only way that you're going to fight against it, or fight back against it, is to point it out and to call it out for what it is. If I summed it up correctly.
Sure, absolutely, man. And like, I think also on the other side, the perpetually victimized African, for me, it's very, very dehumanizing, because it assumes that a black person cannot be malicious just for being malicious. Right? And if the line between good and evil is a human dimension, that dehumanizes black people. It robs them of their essential humanity, their essential choice that, you can actually commit good and you can commit evil. You're not just pushed around by the forces of history. And I think that at that level, I wish for my black brothers and sisters out there that you can discover your agency and really discover your power. I'm not trying to sound like a becoist or anything like that, but I really do think that there is something in that, and to rescue the good that is in every one of you, and not to be just a pawn for an ideology. And likewise, I think the liberal white people that believe themselves to be these saviors, these I don't want to be unrepentant, so I constantly repent for nothing. Just be a good person. You don't have to be driven by a sense of guilt, and just be a good person because you want to build a good future. You don't have to act like an ideological inquisitor and constantly going about purity testing others and talking about your privilege and apologizing for what everyone wants, which is to be in the middle class.
Right. And my final question would be something that we talked about in private, and I think it's something that I wanted to talk to you about with an audience as well, because I think it's so fascinating. And that is my conversation I had actually with one of my good mates, Paul Maritz from the Politik podcast, and we were talking about how he was struggling to rationalize some of these policies by the ANC, and some of the things that they were doing just didn't make sense to him. And he wanted to know my thoughts, if I can see any method in the madness. And I said, no, but you have to understand, this is like trying to rationalize the actions of a psychopath. This is an ideologically possessed party.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to rationalize what they're doing. And I told you this story, and you actually had some very interesting feedback on it.
Well, I said that, first of all, it's very easy to rationalize the behavior of a psychopath. They act in pure self-interest, and they will destroy any barriers in their path, right? Without any empathy, without any, that's a pure self-interest. I want this, I'm going to get that by any means necessary. I really do think, though, that underlying some of this, it seems like revenge to me. Some of these policies really seem like revenge to me, and that shows me that they're possessed by the archetype of the perpetually victimized African. So to compensate for that, they become the victimizer. And they're justified in doing so in their own minds. But it's not rational. It's not it has nothing to do with anything. And I don't understand how, if there are still people out there in South Africa who think some of the lockdown laws are related to the spread of the virus, you are, I don't know, just wrong. And look at it from this perspective, and maybe you'll have a different understanding of things.
Very fascinating take on the matter indeed. But Mr. Ferreira, we've reached the end of our interesting conversation. This time absolutely flew by. Like I said, I missed even my usual halfway through little break that I take just to thank everyone for watching or tuning in. But yeah, I think it's just a testament to the quality of the conversation that you always bring to my show. And I think there's a reason why you've been the fourth time you've appeared now, fourth recurrent time that you've appeared on my show.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to come chat to us. I think this is a very important format to phrase or to convey your article in, because I like I told you in private, I think a lot of people see reading such a long article as very daunting, but when the author himself can explain it and actually answer people's questions live, I think it just adds a completely new dimension to understanding and conceptualizing to understanding this concept that you've injected into the discourse. So, and like I told you on Twitter a few weeks ago, injecting a new term or concept into the discourse is no small feat. I think there's a lot of satisfaction to be had when you invent a term or a phrase and you see other people start using it and seeing the gene spread, as we talked about earlier. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on, Quentin. If you have any final thoughts, please share them now, and then just end off with where people can find you. There is a link to your Twitter in the description.
Cool. Yeah, so most of all, you can find me on Twitter. Please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to @, and I like to engage because I work in IT now and I have a lot of time in front of a computer, so that's all good. But listen, Ernst, on the real, I really want to thank you for the invitation, and I'm actually really honored to be invited back to the stream because some of my favorite people have appeared on your show. Not only are you a great host and you've really built an excellent platform for deep philosophical discussions, but I feel quite happy that I'm in esteemed company of the likes of Mark Oppenheimer, Ramon, Leon Lowe, Ernst Rutz, who I really admire their way of thinking. And also just thanks to everyone who tuned in, and thanks for the love and support, and I return the love.
No, well, I'm just putting some of the final chat messages on the screen. It seems like we had a lot of people enjoying it, man. Let's see, a big fan of yours, this dodgy idealist, Mr. Quentin. Thanks, guys. Love both of your content. Keep it up. Good work. And I'm trying to still twist Quentin's arm to start his own YouTube channel to start making some videos. And we'll see. Maybe I will be successful in the future. Maybe I should up my coercion memes. But anyway, thank you.
The competition is too good, bro.
No, man, there's always room in the free market of YouTube. But thank you. I think lastly now is always I need to thank everyone that tuned in. Your contributions in the chat always make it worthwhile. It's why I look forward. One of the reasons why I look forward to these conversations is to see what type of feedback I get in regards to, not just people saying that they like the show, but people asking questions, people actually making good counterpoints sometimes and being able to address those counterpoints or questions live. I think it's something magical. It's something that has never been possible in human history. And I'm very fortunate and privileged to be living in this time where this is possible and this type of discourse is possible. I think and I don't use the term magic lightly. I do genuinely.
It is magic.
Magic. So, it is. Thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. Mr. Ferreira, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I will have
Thank you, my friend. You too. All right, cheers, guys. Peace and spread love.
Cheers, guys. Have a good one.